Hey, my name is Ev Bannett. Welcome to the Yisod Blocks channel. You can check this out as a podcast, also in an audio form. For this episode, we're going to talk about the coronavirus and Mashiach. The reason we're talking about this is because, well, coronavirus seems to be a very hot topic right now for pretty obvious reasons, although kind of not, maybe some are not so obvious, but definitely some obvious reasons. And I've been getting a lot of pings from different people asking about what I think about this question, what exactly the Mashiach deal is. Mashiach means Messiah, and in Torah and Talmudic and just general Judaism tradition, as well as other religions to a certain degree, there's this idea of somebody called the Messiah, which is like a person who sort of shows up and sort of saves the day. And we actually have it as one of our principles in the Torah, written by, the principle is actually articulated by a few people, but basically the principle that you're supposed to really constantly look towards or look forward towards the Messiah's arrival. And the question is, well, what do we think about this situation right now? We're in a very unusual situation. The whole world is kind of like blocked up, blocked off, a lot of lockdowns, a lot of isolation, a lot of literally unprecedented in a lot of ways types of reactions to the situation that we're currently experiencing in the world stage. And the question is, well, how does this interrelate with the concept of Mashiach? Can we expect Mashiach? Is it something which is real, not real? How do we think about this? How do we put this all into perspective? So in order to do that, I have to sort of differentiate between two things. So there's really two different aspects when we start talking about Mashiach. The concept of Mashiach does not just mean a guy who shows up and saves the day. So you can think about it like this. Mashiach is sort of like a character that there's going to be room for him on the world stage when the world stage is properly set up for him. So what does that look like? Well, when you understand what exactly the mindset is you have to have in order for Mashiach to be there, then you'll understand why Mashiach would sort of show up whenever you have that mindset. Let's just sort of clarify that. So part of it is there's a person who's going to be this character we call Mashiach, but a much more significant part is actually the overall world mindset and perspective towards the reality that we live in. And that perspective has to be clarified in like very specific ways. I don't just mean that everyone is going to suddenly care about Shabbos or the Sabbath or the Torah. I mean something kind of deeper than that. It isn't not that, but it's much more than that, which is that there's a certain way of thinking that is very big and very deep and very real, that when you have sort of like a critical mass of people thinking in that way, that makes room on the world stage for them to be able to receive a certain type of leader who can then take that authenticity and depth and clarity and direct it and funnel it towards a much higher, much more intense type of direction for the whole world consciousness to sort of turn towards. So that the Mashiach character only sort of appears when you have that background. So let's just analyze a little bit what that background looks like, and then sort of try to assess if what we're experiencing now in the world is that background already. Are we getting to that? Are we at that now? Are we on the way to that? Is this nothing to do with that? And let's see if we can get somewhere with that. So first of all, I want to just sort of just to illustrate that this process is something which has actually been gone through, or at least attempted to be gone through in many, many contexts in history. What we call the Mashiach headspace formation is something which anytime there is a break or an opening from a smaller way of being to a larger way of being, the Hebrew word for that is the word geula, commonly translated as the word redemption. It really means to sort of free yourself from what's called a narrower space. The word for the narrow space is the word Mitzrayim, from the word Mitzarim, which means like narrow location. And so in the original story in the Torah, in the book of Exodus and Sefer Shmos, is actually about the process of Bnei Yisrael, our ancestors, getting released from the narrow space of Mitzrayim, which was literally a narrow space, not too different, I mean, different in many ways, I guess, in terms of the intensity and the brutality, but in terms of the isolation and the struggle that we're all feeling today, there's a certain similarity, which is that they were trapped in these narrow spaces, and now they're trying to free themselves from that. So in the story of the Exodus, there's actually a long introduction by the Ramban, Nachmanides, who writes that there were really two phases to the process of the Exodus. The first phase was the actual release, where they actually left the land, the country of Egypt, and were freed from all the physical narrowness they were experiencing at that time, all the burdens and the abuse they were undergoing. Then the next phase was actually an ideological narrowness they had to free themselves from, because if you're a slave and you're an abused person, as we all know, abuse psychology is something which lasts for a long time, leaves a very significant trauma. It can be hard for us to sometimes free ourselves from an abusive psychology and think to ourselves, maybe the rest of the people in the world aren't going to be abusive the way my abuser was. You can get trapped in this headspace. It's very narrow, and you can sort of fail to see the truth of the environment that you're in. So that larger release from the narrowness of mind is something which is actually an ongoing process that all human beings go through constantly. And so really what we're referring to here in terms of the headspace of Mashiach is actually that headspace, that process. It's the ability to sort of free yourself from narrow thinking in every area. So let's go a little deeper for a second. First of all, we have sources in the Talmud that talk about how there are many different people along the way of history who could have been the Mashiach. Chizkiyahu HaMelech was one of them. Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was Mashiach. These are people from thousands of years ago, and people also since then who were believed at different times to be Mashiach. And the reason is because these are people who had very catalytically broad and big perspectives that were far larger than the usual narrow approach that was commonly being utilized at the time. And so whenever somebody would encounter a perspective like that, they don't say, wow, look how broad and big that is. It's so much bigger than the narrow way that I see things. So then people would actually start to think that could be Mashiach, and they're not wrong. So the problem is, of course, that since the people in the surrounding context were not able to raise their own headspace in parallel to that particular person or person's level of broadness, so then the context does not allow for that person to then be the leader who could take those people to the next phase that Mashiach is supposed to really be taking the world into. And we're going to talk about that phase also towards the end. So basically, the headspace is really the more integral element, at least for the earlier part, sort of setting the stage for this character Mashiach to really appear. Because what that kind of implies is that this character could already be here now. In fact, you could have different people throughout every generation who could potentially play the role of the leader that is Mashiach. You just need to have a large enough group, I guess you could say, or a large enough trend towards true broad thinking to then set the stage for this character to then become the leader of that. And so then, obviously, what that kind of leads us to is the major question, which is, well, what exactly is the nature or the mapping, the structure of this kind of thinking that lends itself then to creating a space for that kind of leader to come and sort of lead us to where we need to go next? So I'm going to use a couple of examples to illustrate how this works. One that I kind of feel like is it's a little bit of a hot button topic right now because we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic as the time of this video being created, this episode being created. But the example I want to use is earlier on, about a month ago, as this whole coronavirus COVID-19 situation started to unfold. So a lot of people made comments about how this is no different from the flu, or forget no different, it seems to be even less deadly. The number of people that actually have died from it is pretty low, and it's not a lot of cases, and we're sort of shutting down the world for literally 100,000, 200,000 people who have been infected with only a few thousand who have actually died from it. And in that thought structure, so there were a lot of different responses in the social space, the media space, social media, and what we all did as a society and a world society, really, we all started to sort of absorb the arguments from both sides, what each person thought, and which was the popular opinion and the not so popular, and which is the contrarian opinion, and there's a lot of different dynamics there socially going on, people arguing for and against that idea. And what I want to sort of do is just ignore that whole conversation for a second, the back and forth, and just sort of zoom in on just one element for a second, which is, see, what I found very interesting about the entire discussion is that the question of the flu versus this coronavirus, this new virus. So it was almost like we were sort of saying, well, we have the regular flu, and a lot of people died from that, and then now we have to start sort of operating differently because we have this new virus. And what's funny to me about that whole thing is that the embedded assumption was, well, the flu is not such a big deal, and we sort of handle that fine, and now this new virus is a big deal, or isn't, if you disagree, and then question is, how do we deal with that? But as a person, and I'm sure there are many out there in the in YouTube land who would agree with me. So some of us have already been very cognizant of the fact that many people die every year from the flu. The flu is very painful. Friends that I've had that got it and were like out for a week from work, and it was just very difficult. And a lot of us know the flu is bad and hard, and some of us have lost relatives to the flu, and it was traumatizing and tragic. And we also, many of us know to like wash our hands and like to also constantly be on the lookout. Like, I work in a school, so I'm always very aware that like people are spreading disease to me, and I try to avoid viruses. And to me, this was not like a new phenomenon. It wasn't something like, oh my gosh, the flu is not a big deal, but this is a big deal. I was like, this is the same deal. I have no idea yet how many people could die from this particular bug, but like in terms of the responses, like I'm not in any way startled that like these are all good ideas. We should definitely try to be more sanitary and constantly try to take care of our hygiene, because if you're hugging people, shaking people's hands, I'm not capable of shaking people's hands at this point in my life without washing my hands afterwards, because I have gotten sick so many times from physical contact in that way that I just assume that's what's going to happen. So now whenever I shake people's hands, I just always wash my hands. So what's interesting about that whole sort of setup of thoughts is that for a lot of people, it sort of sounded like the flu thing was like a write-off. It was an easy thing. And this new thing is like, well, now we should really start to wash our hands. And to me, I was kind of like, well, why is that? And so that whole thought process kind of led me a little deeper, and the analysis was, okay, people are thinking about this in a funny way. I guess they generally take the flu for granted as like an easy come, easy go type of situation, and now this new thing is like very much in their face. It's very much noticeable because everyone's talking about it. And so that the response was to sort of hype that up and sort of be like, well, the flu, we don't need to worry so much, but we need to worry about this in terms of all the hygienic responses. So then I analyzed that a little bit more deeply, and I started thinking, you know what, it's funny, like, when you really don't pay attention to the flu in that way, what are you really doing? You're kind of ignoring that like every year 60,000 people die from like a random virus, in America at least. And I was like, well, how do you ignore that, but now suddenly you're not ignoring this? It's funny because like not a lot of people have died from this virus compared to the flu, but you're paying so much attention to this virus that it's literally dominating. I mean, I just spoke to a family member of mine, she's like, it's all she's thinking about is this virus. I'm like, you never think about the flu at all. And so the question is like, well, what's going on underneath that? And I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. We all know how that works. There's some element is that, there's some actual information that says this virus could be worse. But more deeply, there's a much larger psychology here, which is that things that we're used to, things that are more known, they fade into the background and we're sort of less aware of them. And things that are more unknown and new and potentially different are things that are going to be very noticed by us. And for those of you who've been watching some of my content, this is a function of a distorted perspective we call das tov vara, where you tend to fixate on certain things and other things just fall into the background. And so then you have to go a little deeper. Well, if the flu dynamic is sort of falling into the background, what does that really say about the way that you're thinking? If you want to argue, let's pick one particular person's counter argument. You'll argue and say, well, in this case though, that first of all, people are dying from this virus, so that's obviously bad, and it's also bad that people die from the flu. Well, the reason why I have a hard time with that perspective in general is because you start talking about people dying from a virus or dying in general, so there's something that's underneath that which needs to be analyzed carefully. What exactly is the problem when somebody dies? Why do we have a problem with that? Now, I know that seems like an obvious type of question, like I'm not saying what's the big deal. I'm saying like what exactly, if you have to quantify the problem when somebody dies, what exactly is the issue? And I think if you think very carefully about what the issue is, then things like the flu and other deaths that are constantly going on around us will sort of stop fading into the background, will stop being distorted and being taken for granted, and sort of start to fade into the foreground more and become part of a larger picture of how to think about life, which is going to be much bigger and broader than just, well, whatever's in my immediate situation and environment gets paid attention to, and other things fall into the background. And this is really the beginning of the doorway to understanding the headspace of what Mashiach perspective is actually like. And so let's think about that for a second. The Torah's description of this is, well, we have a body, and then this body is a conduit for the neshama, the self, to shine through, just like I'm shining through right now. And whenever a body turns off and shuts down, we call death. So now the access to that self, we call the neshama, is drastically reduced. In other words, you can't access another person's consciousness very easily if their body is non-functional. That's what we've already, everybody knows that. If somebody's body is asleep, for example, it's very hard to access them. The Talmud writes that sleep is a 60th of death because it's very similar to death in terms of the accessibility, but at the same time, the consciousness is still tethered to the body, so therefore it's not really death. It's also true with people who are comatose. In other words, when a body is non-functional, it's a situation in which now the consciousness, in other words, the neshama, the self that we talk about, is now no longer being channeled into the world in a way that we can access in the way that we are used to. And so the actual value of that is like, well, we all obviously like our connections and our relationships. We yearn for connection with the people who are in our lives. And so when we suddenly lose the ability to do that, that's very important for us. Go a little bit more deeply underneath that. And the question is, well, why is that so important for us? Why do we care so much about losing access to other selves that are a part of our lives? Well, the Torah's description of that, and I think if you think intuitively, you'll sense this in yourself, is because you sense that people who are a part of your life are in a certain way a part of yourself. In other words, when you build a relationship with another person, so what you're really doing is you're sort of exposing or revealing the fact that yourself, the neshama, the consciousness that you are, that is shining through this body, is actually in some way the same one, connected, merged with another self shining through a different body, and that at the root you're really one person that is sort of experiencing this world through two different frames of reference. That's a very profound thing. We call that the oneness of love. And so that as just a thought process is like, well, whenever somebody else's body shuts off, so then there's suddenly a sense of loss of self. I just lost a part of myself when their body turned off. And now my journey of continuing to connect to the rest of me, which is all the other selves in the world, that journey is being interrupted and is now being sort of temporarily, or in my mind sometimes even permanently, shut down and blocked off. So now I can no longer journey forward to continue to discover who I am and how I and the other selves are all part of one giant story. So that's why we do not like death, because death sort of flies in the face of what we believe we're here for. We think we're here to live as characters in a story that we're all part of, that we're going somewhere. We don't really ever want to leave. We don't want other people to leave either. We sort of want to continue to grow and connect more and more deeply. And the only time that we really decide we want to leave is when things are so bad here that connection is completely impossible. And then people will say, well, I'm in so much pain, I can't connect, or there's so many problems that there's just no way to functionally connect that it's better if I wasn't here anymore. But overall, we are interested in continuing that journey with each other constantly, and that's why when people are suddenly removed from that context, it's very challenging. But here's the thing. See, if you don't think about that, if you don't access that headspace, if you don't learn all those stages of connection, right? What did we just say? We said it's bad when people die, but only people who are like, if it's right in my face. Well, is it really though? Like people who are not in your face is also bad, even though you might not sense it, but it's bad for them. And well, why is it bad when people die? Because people are each endless selves, consciousness that is now not accessible. And while we are all part of each other, and we're all kind of part of the story, if you learn all those ideas and you actually start to experience the world that way, and if you think very deeply about what those ideas imply, how they imply that you're not just a body, you're something which is sort of endlessly beyond that, well then suddenly the whole discussion of which virus, which situation, it all kind of enters a much more proportionate or properly organized, let's say, set of ideas where now the value of life can be understood both in situations which are not this virus. You can sort of think about people who have the flu in a much more intense, real way and realize the loss that they felt when they suddenly lost their loved one from a random virus, as well as people who lost their loved one from a random other disease or from a plane crash or a car crash or some other problem or a suicide. And you can start to really sort of get a sense of where these things are sort of coming together. And there's really again, not that you should then be sort of constantly shoving death in your face, but sort of understanding what death is and how death is kind of like this problem that interrupts our ability to create love, and that's what makes death so much of an issue in our lives. And so when you sort of have that more clear in your head, and again, there's many more principles here that are sort of beneath that, well, what you just did was, theoretically, if you thought that through in a real way, it should, at least somewhat, have done something which I like to call, which is not my own phrase, blowing your mind. What does it mean to blow your mind? It means that you had this idea, you're like, oh, death is bad. Now it's like, wait, death is bad because it's a loss of self through a body. Loss of self through a body means that now I can't access another self. It means I can't connect to another self, which means I can't continue on my journey of self-discovery and self-connection with other selves, and we can't all be part of this one family growing towards whatever the purpose of this world is, the purpose of our lives is. So that thought process kind of going from just death is bad to that much more expanded perspective is what we call blowing of our minds, because now instead of having a narrow perspective that things are just, well, death is just bad and everyone knows why, right? We just know it's bad. And by the way, that's how this goes very often. People will just sort of say, well, we all know why this is bad. Death is just bad. It's like, it's not wrong. It's just that it's so shallow and so narrow that you're going to feel like you're stuck in this narrow space, to the point where if you then have debates about these things with other people on Facebook or on the media or whatever, the conversation just becomes it's a very narrow conversation. No one really thinks that death is good. People sometimes say things like, well, it has a role to play, or life matters more. Like, because of death, there's so many different ideas that float around, but because they're so isolated, no one's sort of thinking how all these ideas connect and creating a framework that they're all proportionately positioned. So then it just creates a lot of confusion and a lot of just a sense of being untethered and sort of all over the place. And so that is the process of going from like a fragmented, like, here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an idea, to a Mashiach headspace. Mashiach headspace means that now you've learned all the ideas, you have clarity how things fit together, and then you're literally blowing your mind from a narrow perspective, which is just fragmented and confused, to understanding who you are, what life is about, where you're going, and what this is for, in a way that is constantly getting broader and broader and broader. And so that's something which I think it's very possible. It involves a few things. First of all, it involves being aware of human beings' shortcomings. You have to sort of realize that people are very prone to distorting ideas and sort of seeing things out of sync. You got to really do, as an example, you have to sort of read a lot. So right now the finance world is collapsing, and if you've read many of the accounts of different financial analysts and just Warren Buffett and all of his students and predecessors and people like that, like, what's happening now in the world is not new in any way, but you have to sort of read like 100 books that all sort of share all the different histories, what happened in every different crash in the market, and how people react and why they react that way. And so once you sort of see that whole picture, well, then you're not going to be part of it in the same way, because you're sort of aware of it, and you're able to sort of not be in the narrow space of, well, it's going up, it's going down, the market's this, the market's that, the stocks are this, stocks are that, the oil is this, the oil is that. Like, instead of kind of getting sucked into these things, you're able to sort of see there's a much bigger pattern here, and you're sort of a little bit outside of it. That's what allows you to then potentially, hopefully, not do as badly, or maybe even profit off of these complicated situations. So the same thing is true with the Torah. There's so many concepts that are out there that you have to sort of access, start to see how these pieces fit together, and they just need to be learned. So instead of just learning about Hilchos Shabbos or random Daf Yomi Gemaras, there's a lot of things that need to be learned that are in the Torah, in the Talmud, in the Gemara, in the Midrashim, that need to be analyzed and thought about. That's really what the whole point of this channel is, and other people who are doing what I'm trying to do, which is talk about the things that are not talked about so often, so we can put them into the puzzle piece picture and then understand how the system actually works. So with all that as a background, let's just sort of wrap this up and go towards the Mashiach concept here. When you get a preponderance, a critical mass of people who are doing that kind of thinking, who are looking to understand things. They're not looking to react. They don't hear a line about the flu and say, no, you're wrong because this, no, you're wrong because that, no, you don't care, no, you don't care. Like, they're not doing that kind of reactive thinking and talking, which is what is going on the right and the left in the politics sphere. It's going on in the media sphere pretty much constantly. That entire argumentative approach, which is designed to elicit more and more reactivity from the various people on both sides to polarize. So we're talking about rising above all that when you're not part of that. And most people are actually not interested in just arguing those types of polarizing ideas, but instead they're interested in understanding. What do you genuinely think? What situation would you say that abortion is good? In what situation would you say abortion is not good? And what's your underlying understanding of that? What does it mean to have a fetus? Is a fetus an actual person? Well, what is a person? Is a person consciousness? Is a person a body? Is a person something that's consciousness shining through a body? Well, what about a baby that doesn't even have consciousness yet? A little baby, a 5-year-old? Is there a way to understand those different gradations? How do we think about that? And the answer is yes. There's lots and lots and lots of information about that, both in science and in the Torah, that needs to be discussed and thought about when we're having these conversations. But instead we have these very vague, polarizing conversations. You're pro-life, I'm pro-choice, and that's just the end of it. And if I'm pro-choice, that means I think women are allowed to do whatever they want with their bodies. And if you're pro-life, then they're not allowed to. And that's the argument. And that's a child argument. There's nothing there to talk about. So, and again, the two sides don't even really think those things. You actually sat down and got off of the polarizing thing, you could actually understand what each person is really thinking about every situation and case. You'll find that most people are this far apart in their ideas, if they're even apart. So that's the basic freedom of mind that we need to sort of create to achieve Mashiach. So that kind of gets us to our final point here. Well, this situation right now, is this a Mashiach runway or not? Well, I'll tell you a couple things. One is, it's very interesting what's happening. I mean, this is unprecedented, as you all know. This is a completely new phenomenon. What I can say is for sure happening is that we have something here called Yissurin. Yissurin means something which now shoves you. The word Yissurin comes from the word lasur. It usually is translated as suffering, but does not mean suffering. It means that which makes you change direction. When you are lasur, so you're now changing your path. Well, Yissurin means things that cause people to sort of be moved. They now are going to think more carefully or more deeply about what they're going through and decide if their path is actually good or not. And that Yissurin always is a automatic result, or is even the same thing as change in your life. Whenever something changes in your life, so you have a certain routine, something suddenly it veers, that's called Yissurin, because people tend to sort of continue on the same path, but their life just veered. And they're like, oh, this is so uncomfortable. I want to go this way because I'm so used to going this way. I'm being forced to go that way. That's Yissurin. So we are all experiencing a certain amount of Yissurin right now. If you're the kind of person who is very open to Yissurin, always looking for more change, and constantly you have a very big picture perspective, so whatever happens, you're not really so surprised by it. You're kind of like, well, this was one of a number of possibilities, and I'm going to use this now in the same philosophy I have about how to deal with all of life in my big picture perspective. I'm now going to somehow incorporate and digest this new phenomenon, and then sort of use it to continue my process of evolution, connection, and growth. That's what I'm here to do. So, and even though it's hard and painful, and there's death involved and suffering, but I'm going to use all those difficult things and all the good things that come out of it too, which there are good things that are coming out of this whole situation, which everyone knows about. So I'm going to use these things to become more of what I need to become in my life and in the world. So if you're using these Yissurin in that way, well, then you're achieving more and more and more Mashiach perspective. And the interesting thing is that this is a very large-scale type of Yissurin, which unifies many, many people in terms of the experiences that they're all sharing. So that's a little bit unprecedented in terms of the Mashiach dynamic, because what it kind of leads to is this is driving people to be a little bit more thoughtful. It's driving people to be a little bit more real, because they're being forced to pull back from their routines and start contemplating their actual path and their trajectory in their lives. Now, is that enough to make it a Mashiach runway that we can now expect this is going to be like Mashiach happening in terms of, will the world turn into this Mashiach-ready place in the next 6 weeks or 2 months or whatever? That is highly unlikely, just because that amount of time is not enough to really get everybody to suddenly completely open their minds to higher consciousness and broader perspectives. So if it's a 6 months or 2 months or 1 month, process here, it's unlikely this will cause in itself enough of a shift in people's consciousness to lead to Mashiach. It could, but it's, again, you have to look at that data. The data is like, are people getting broad-minded enough from the situation to be that way? So far, most data points the other way. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of anger, a lot of sadness, a lot of fear, a lot of chaos in a lot of different ways. So those things are kind of, pointing to the opposite, or maybe not the opposite, but at least they're not showing that we're getting to that point yet. So if this went on for like a whole year and the world basically stopped in its tracks for a year or 2 years, so then we're really talking about a world-changing event. Like, that's a permanent change, which it's unclear how that would even play out and what that would mean. Not saying that's a good thing in any way, but like, there would be a lot of factors there to start to analyze, and there would probably be some people who would move towards a broader, spirituality, consciousness development and expansion perspective, while a lot of other people would probably move towards a fear and looting and very dangerous primitive perspective. So there's no way to really gauge that at this point, but it does seem like we're having an interesting situation, so that's just how to think about the Yissurin component. On an individual level, what I would say, though, and this is, I think, very relevant to any person who's just watching this, so all of you are, just to think about this part, especially in the Jewish community, but just true in general, you can use this as an opportunity to create higher level thinking on purpose once you're aware of this way of being. In other words, once you know that the goal of being here is to get to a broader perspective and to sort of constantly expand your consciousness to connect more and more and more to others and to sort of learn more and more deeply who you are and what this world is about, which is what all of Torah learning actually is. So once you know that's the point of this, you can use these experiences for that. So as an example, I've heard a lot of rabbis and a lot of different people talking about how right now none of us are able to go to the synagogue, to daven together, to do tefillah together in groups, and we're being forced to be in isolation and separate. Well, some people say that's something which is, it's good in a certain way. Why is it good? Because then you're going to miss it when you come back and you'll really value it a lot more later. So I completely disagree with that. I don't think that's true at all. I think that people will miss it, definitely, and then we'll come back to it later, maybe in a month or 2 months, and feel a little bit of appreciation, in the short run, maybe for a week or two, and be like, oh, this is so nice again. Maybe some of them will have larger scars, so they'll feel more like appreciation even for longer than that. but I think people will just as much feel like they're just happy to be around their friends again. They're just happy to be out of their houses. And a lot less will be about appreciating what the spiritual nature of a synagogue is, and much more about sort of just being back to normal. It's also true with schools and with kids, and just sort of having the freedom to have our kids go to school again. Many parents will say, I'm so happy my kids are going back to school so they can learn. But also a lot of parents are just going to be happy that their kids are no longer in the house, because parents very often are not trained to parent, because their kids are usually being parented by people they're paying in schools, which is a much longer discussion on its own. So I would argue that's actually not something which is particularly relevant, that, not being able to go to the synagogue. I would say there's actually a much more powerful thing here to take out of the situation, which is that suddenly if you're not able to go to the synagogue, or you're not able to actually send your kids to school, you are now forced to be who you really are by yourself, which is a very hard thing to do for a lot of people, especially in the Torah and spirituality and Judaism space, to actually say, well, I'm not davening with a minyan. I'm not davening with a group of people now. I'm not doing tefillah anymore with a group. It's just me. So usually when you miss minyan, so you're kind of like, well, I missed it, so I'm just going to do my own davening, and it's not such a big deal because I miss minyan, so kind of like they did the real davening, I'll do like a little davening, and then I'll kind of move on. If you're not missing minyan anymore, now you're davening on purpose at home, so now you actually have to really figure out what's that going to be like. And you don't have a short-term situation here. This could be going on for another month or two. Your tefillah at home for the next 2 months, you got to figure out what you're going to do with that. You're just going to do nothing. You're going to sort of coast through that and not really pay any attention to it, not think about it, not do any differerently, not try to get deeper into what exactly it is. It's just you and the tefillah now. There's nobody else there. There's no other people to socially pressure you. There's no, being able to be distracted from tefillah because when you're bored, you can go talk to your friend. You got to actually figure out what your relationship is with this thing. Same thing is true with learning Torah. Same thing is true with with being a parent. You got to suddenly actually learn your kids and sort of see what they're like in an entire day. And the norm is not that your kids are in school. The norm is that your kids are in a relationship with you as parents. And this is a thing that for you to do as a real person, to actually get to learn who these people are in your family and in your life in a way that is really that you're not used to, just because you sort of trained yourself out of it. And so that's a very intense set of challenges that you can really, kind of go head first in and use. And so I think that's, you're supposed to really be investing in yourself now and making yourself stronger internally and authentic and real in terms of your relationship with who you are, with your relationship with Torah, with your relationship with tefillah, your relationship with other people on the inside, to become more of an independent self. And then when you go back out into the world, you can then be more of a contributor and an active presence instead of someone who's just sort of there letting the group sort of pull things. On the peer pressure level, you're kind of just getting pulled along with that. So that's a very important principle, I think, here, that's really what you should be doing with these Yissurin. When you're forced to be isolated, that means you need to be with yourself, and you have to be with your family, and you got to figure out what you really care about. That's really what the avoda of this is. You do that effectively, so maybe it'll lead to a Mashiach situation in the short term. Maybe not. There's definitely some interesting things going on. Like I said, one other thing is the seasonal time period of this. It's right before Pesach, and Pesach is the time of freeing yourself from Mitzrayim and opening your mind to bigger perspectives. But it could be just a short-term example of that, a smaller one, and it's sort of like a little earthquake before we get to the bigger one in the next who knows how many years, the real Mashiach time period. But the point is that if you use this time now to do that expansion process, and you're opening yourself to who Mashiach is and who you could be as a part of that stage-setting effect, so then you're doing what you need to do no matter what time period you're in. Whether he's coming tomorrow or in 100 years from now, it is irrelevant, because your job is to be that person who is setting the stage that way. That's why we say, the Medrash says in Parshas Vayechi, we do not calculate when Mashiach comes, because it's not about that. It's not about when Mashiach is coming. It's about when you're going to be free. When are you going to do the geula you need to do to actually allow for that leader to even show up? And yes, at some point, when you have enough people that are going to free themselves in that way, there will be a leader who will see that and who will say, I know what to do with this, will show up and then sort of take everybody to an even higher state of being that we call Olam Haba, which is a much longer discussion of immortality and, really beyond all small perspectives. It's a much longer thing. It does not mean heaven. It's an immortal life in this world, like right here. But the point is, that's after we get ourselves to that place. So your job here is not to be like, oh, I hope somebody will come and save me. Your job now is the opposite of that. It's to save yourself from the situation that you are in. In other words, you have whatever small perspectives that you have, whatever distorted ways of thinking that you have right now in your head. Your job is to use these Yissurin to break those, blow your own mind, learn more, read more, understand more, figure yourself out. Have difficult conversations with the people in your family. Try to learn them. Try to listen. Try to Ask questions that are real or penetrating, that you don't usually ask. Things that you're nervous about that you don't really want to find out about. Things that you're kind of nervous to say about yourself. Those are all areas where you are being narrow, where you're hiding from things that are important. And so use this time to become more real, more transparent, more authentic. Figure out where you're insecure, things that you don't like about yourself that you're hiding, that you have problems with, and put them out there. Figure them out with your wife, with your husband, with your father, with your son, like whatever it is, and try to get that kind of rolling. That's the process here. If you do that, then yeah, Mashiach's coming, because you're bringing Mashiach energy through you, and then you're just contributing more building blocks, raising up the whole world one little piece at a time towards getting us there. So again, in terms of the actual person, well, we'll have to wait and see. But in terms of what you can do, this is a great time to do all that. So use that time wisely and think about all the ways to do it effectively, proactively, instead of just being a victim. I don't know what to do. I'm so afraid. I'm so worried. Be like, I'm going to use this to become an even greater me. Whatever happens, I know that I will always have that result, that I'll be someone who's more real in that way. Hope that's useful. Think about all that stuff and see if that's if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and looking forward to seeing you in the future videos.